The mahogany floors of the Bennett estate gleamed like a polished casket, reflecting a life that had died the same day Kendra's father was lowered into the ground. She knelt in the shadows of the grand foyer, her knuckles raw from scrubbing the marble, watching the light from the Swarovski chandelier splinter into 1,000 sharp needles. Above her, the air was heavy with the scent of gardenias and the suffocating arrogance of the creditors who now held the family's future in their manicured hands. Kendra was a ghost in her own home, a servant in a dress that had seen better years, invisible to everyone who mattered. Kendra. Her stepmother's voice didn't just call her name, it sliced through the silence like a jagged blade. Kendra didn't look up from the floor. She didn't have to. She could hear the rhythmic click of Vanessa's designer heels, the sound of a woman who had spent a husband's legacy before his body was even cold. "Stop wallowing in the dirt and finish Tiana's vanity," Vanessa hissed, her words a low poison meant only for Kendra's ears. Kendra flinched, her grip tightening on the damp cloth. "And for heaven's sake, stay out of the light. You look like a stray dog that wandered in from the rain." "Yes, ma'am," Kendra whispered. The words felt like lead on her tongue, but she had learned long ago that silence was the only armor she had left. Vanessa swept past in a cloud of expensive perfume and sharp diamonds, leaving Kendra in the wake of her disdain. She headed toward Tiana, who sat like a porcelain doll in the center of the drawing room, draped in ivory silk that cost more than their father's funeral. Kendra's stepsister was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, all cold smiles and entitlement. Tonight was supposed to be Tiana's victory. She was to be the sacrificial lamb to settle the family's mountain of debt, wed to a man whose name was spoken only in hushed, terrified prayers. Kang Tae-jin, the youngest head of the city's most brutal Korean crime family, a king who ruled from a wheelchair, a broken monster with ink on his skin and ice in his veins. They thought they were throwing Kendra to the wolves to save their own skin. They didn't realize that in a city of predators, the man in the chair was the only one who knew how to hunt. They sold her to a monster to save their own skin, but he ended up being her only sanctuary. Would you sell your soul to a devil if he was the only person who ever truly saw your worth? Before we proceed with the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. The shadows of the Bennett estate didn't just hold dust. They held memories of a time when the air didn't taste of desperation. Kendra moved through the grand library, her cloth tracing the spines of books her father had once read to her, feeling the hollow ache of his absence in every silent corner. It had been 3 years since the sudden, heart-shattering stroke that had claimed him, and in that time, the house had been hollowed out from the inside, stripped of its warmth like a tree, losing its bark to a winter freeze. Vanessa had moved with a terrifying, surgical precision. Before the funeral flowers had even wilted, the locks had been changed. The bank accounts, once meant to secure Kendra's education and future, had been diverted into trusts that only Vanessa and Tiana could touch. Piece by piece, the history of Kendra's mother, the first Mrs. Bennett, whose soft brown skin and elegant laughter were now nothing but faded photographs, was systematically erased. Her jewelry had been sold to pay for Tiana's seasonal wardrobes. Her piano had been traded to cover Vanessa's mounting losses at the high-stakes tables of underground clubs. Kendra had watched it all happen from the periphery. At 19, she had been a daughter. At 20, she became a nuisance. By 22, she was an employee who didn't get a paycheck. "You're missing the molding on the south wall." Vanessa's voice drifted from the doorway, sharp and cold as an icicle. Kendra didn't startle this time. She simply adjusted her stance, her fingers cramping around the wood polish. She looked at the woman who had replaced her mother, a woman whose beauty was a curated mask of expensive creams and borrowed status. Vanessa stood there, draped in a silk robe that had been purchased with the last of the family's liquid assets, her eyes scanning the room not for memories, but for equity. "The house is being appraised on Friday," Vanessa continued, her tone conversational yet laced with a warning. I expect it to be spotless. If the lenders see even a speck of dust, they'll think the property is as decayed as the Bennett name has become. My father built this name to last, Kendra said, her voice low and steady, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Vanessa laughed, a short, jagged sound. Your father built a house of cards, Kendra. He was a sentimental fool who thought loyalty mattered more than leverage. Now, his legacy is a ledger of red ink that I am tired of looking at. If you want to keep a roof over your head, you'll stop acting like a martyr and start acting like the help. Kendra turned back to the wall, the sting of the words familiar but no less painful. She remembered the day her father had told her that this house was her anchor. He hadn't realized that once he was gone, the anchor would become a weight meant to drown her. As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the library floor, Kendra realized the true extent of the theft. It wasn't just the money or the jewelry. Vanessa had stolen the very ground Kendra stood on. While Tiana spent her days at the city's most exclusive spas, perfecting the art of being a socialite, Kendra was relegated to the servants' quarters in the basement, the same rooms her father's staff had once occupied. She was the leftover daughter, a remnant of a better era that Vanessa was determined to bury. Every double shift, Kendra worked at the local diner to buy her own food. Every night she spent shivering under a thin blanket while the heat was turned off in her wing of the house was a testament to the systematic erasure of her existence. But as she looked out at the rolling hills of the estate, now overgrown and neglected, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It was a cold, hard resolve. They had taken her name, her home, and her father's memory, but they hadn't yet broken the quiet intensity that lived behind her dark eyes. She didn't know yet that the debt Vanessa had accrued was about to demand a payment far more personal than a house. She didn't know that the creditors were no longer interested in the land or the silver. They were coming for a bride. And as Kendra watched the black sedans of the debt collectors pull into the gravel driveway through the library window, she felt the first chill of a fate she could never have imagined. A fate where being leftover was exactly what would make her the most dangerous piece on the board. The roar of the black sedans outside was the sound of a closing trap. Kendra stood by the frosted library window, watching as 4 men in sharp, midnight dark suits stepped onto the gravel, their presence cutting through the fatting elegance of the Bennett estate like a cold front. These weren't the bank's usual auditors. They moved with the heavy, calculated grace of men who were used to collecting things far more precious than collateral. Inside the drawing room, the air had turned brittle. Vanessa sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, her usual poise replaced by a frantic, vibrating tension. Across from her sat Mr. Choi, the primary stakeholder in what remained of the Bennett business empire. He didn't look like a criminal, but the way Vanessa's hands shook as she offered him tea said otherwise. The debt is no longer just a matter of numbers, Vanessa, Mr. Choi said, his voice a calm, terrifying monotone. You've bled the company dry. My partners are not patient men. They don't want the deeds to a crumbling house or empty warehouses. They want stability. They want an alliance. Vanessa swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward Tiana, who was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone with a bored, practiced indifference. An alliance? We are willing to negotiate any terms, Mr. Choi, whatever the interest rate. This isn't about interest, Choi interrupted, leaning forward. My cousin, Kang Tae-jin, is the head of the family now. He is a man of tradition, and he requires a wife to solidify his standing. The debt is forgiven the moment a Bennett woman signs the marriage contract. If not, well, the foreclosure will be the least of your worries. My partners have a very particular way of dealing with those who steal from them. The word marriage hung in the room like a guillotine. Kendra, standing in the doorway, saw the blood drain from Tiana's face. The broken king! The man in the wheelchair. The stories of Tae-jin's ruthlessness were legendary. A monster who had survived an assassination attempt only to emerge more vicious than before. I won't do it, Tiana snapped, finally dropping the phone. I'm not spending my life as a glorified nurse for a man who can't even stand up. It's disgusting. Do you know what people say about him? He's a butcher, Mother. I'd rather go to prison. Vanessa reached out, grabbing Tiana's hand, her voice a desperate whisper. Tiana, look at him. Look at the alternative. If we don't settle this, we lose everything. We'll be on the street by morning. I don't care. Tiana stood up, her eyes flashing with a secret, frantic energy. I'm not a piece of property you can just trade away. Tiana stormed out of the room, her silk heels clicking sharply against the marble. Kendra moved to step out of her way, but Tiana shoved past her, her face a mask of jagged fury. Kendra watched her go, sensing a shift in the air, a hidden current she didn't yet understand. Later that night, the house was a tomb of silent tension. Kendra was finishing the laundry in the basement when she heard a low whistle from the garden gate. She moved to the small, high window and saw Tiana huddled near the rose bushes, wrapped in a trench coat she shouldn't have been wearing in this heat. A man emerged from the shadows. He was young, dressed in a leather jacket that screamed of rebellion and cheap thrills, the exact opposite of the refined, dangerous world of Kang Ti-jin. Tiana threw herself into his arms, the desperation in her movements visible even from a distance. I can't do it, Jax, Tiana sobbed into his chest. They're trying to sell me. They're trying to force me into that wheelchair with him. We're leaving, the man whispered, his voice rough. Tomorrow night after the rehearsal dinner, I have the car hidden by the South Creek. We'll go to the coast. Your mother can't stop us once we're across the state line. Kendra pulled back from the window, her heart racing. Tiana wasn't just protesting, she was planning an escape. She was going to leave the debt, the Mafia, and the Bennett name behind. But Kendra knew Vanessa. She knew her stepmother wouldn't let the prize slip through her fingers. If Tiana vanished, the Mafia wouldn't just walk away. They would look for the next available asset. As Kendra walked back through the darkened halls of her father's house, she felt the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on her. The stakeholders didn't care which Bennett daughter wore the veil. They only cared that the contract was signed in blood. She looked at her raw, red hands, the hands of a servant, and then at the closed door of the drawing room where Vanessa was likely already plotting her next move. The choice was no longer between marriage and ruin. For Kendra, the choice was becoming clear. She could either watch the house burn down around her, or she could become the fire that saved it. But as she thought of the man in the wheelchair, the ink-stained monster waiting in the penthouse, she realized that the debt of the Bennett family was about to become her own personal prison. Or perhaps her only chance at freedom. The morning of the wedding arrived not with a celebratory dawn, but with a suffocating, heavy fog that clung to the Bennett estate like a shroud. Inside, the silence was absolute until the scream tore through the master suite. Kendra was in the laundry room, the scent of starch and bleach stinging her eyes, when the sound of shattering glass echoed from upstairs. She found Vanessa standing in the center of Tiana's bedroom, her face a mask of ashen horror. The ivory silk wedding gown was draped over the vanity like a ghost, but the girl who was supposed to wear it was gone. The window was ajar, the sheer curtains snapping in the damp breeze, and a frantic, handwritten note lay crumpled on the floor. Tiana had chosen Jax over the crown. She had chosen the road over the debt. She's gone, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling with a lethal edge. The little fool actually did it. She's destroyed us. Below, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of the vanguard. The Mafia didn't do fashionably late. 3 black SUVs pulled into the driveway with the synchronized precision of a firing squad. Kang Ti-jin's men had arrived to collect their prize, and they weren't the kind of men who accepted a refund. Vanessa's head snapped toward the doorway, her eyes locking onto Kendra. In that moment, the predatory calculation returned to her gaze, sharper and more desperate than ever before. She didn't see her stepdaughter. She saw a last-minute insurance policy. Get in here, Vanessa commanded, her voice suddenly as cold and steady as a heartbeat. Vanessa, what are you? Kendra didn't have time to finish. Vanessa lunged forward, grabbing Kendra's arm with a strength born of pure survival instinct. She dragged her toward the full-length mirror, her fingers digging into Kendra's skin. Tiana is gone. If those men walk into this house and find an empty altar, they won't just take the house. They'll take our lives. Do you understand? They will burn this estate with us inside it. You can't do this, Kendra gasped, struggling against the grip. I'm not Tiana, they'll know. T-Jin will know. He's never seen her face, Vanessa hissed, throwing Kendra into the vanity chair. The contract says a Bennett daughter. It doesn't specify which one. You have her eyes, her height, and under a heavy enough veil, you are whoever I say you are. With a frantic, trembling energy, Vanessa began to strip the simple cotton dress from Kendra's body. Kendra felt like a doll being prepared for a ritual she didn't understand. The ivory silk was cold against her skin, the corset tightening around her ribs until she could barely breathe. It was a dress meant for a queen, but on Kendra, it felt like a gilded cage. The doorbell rang, a low, ominous chime that vibrated through the floorboards. They're here, Vanessa whispered. She grabbed the heavy lace veil, its intricate floral embroidery shimmering in the dim light. She didn't place it on Kendra's head. She draped it over her like a heavy, suffocating weight, pinning it into the textured curls of her updo with a ferocity that drew blood. Vanessa forced Kendra to stand and turned her toward the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the leftover daughter who scrubbed floors. She was a vision in white, her dark eyes wide with a quiet, restrained intensity. The veil obscured her features just enough to turn her into a mystery, a sacrificial lamb dressed in the finest lace. Listen to me, Vanessa said, grabbing Kendra's face, her diamonds catching the light like weapons. You walk down those stairs. You keep your head down. You sign that contract. If you say a single word, if you try to run, you aren't just killing yourself. You're ending everything your father worked for. Do this, and the debt is gone. Do this, and you'll never have to scrub another floor in your life. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, the disciplined, synchronized tread of men who lived by the gun. A sharp rap on the door followed. The boss is waiting, a deep, accented voice called through the wood. Vanessa straightened Kendra's shoulders, her expression shifting into a practiced, tragic mask of a mother losing her daughter. She leaned in, her breath smelling of bitter almonds and expensive gin. Go on, Kendra. Go meet your husband. As the door swung open and the light from the hallway spilled into the room, Kendra felt the air leave her lungs. She stepped forward, the heavy train of the gown hissing against the floor like a snake. She wasn't just walking toward an altar. She was walking into the jaws of a lion. And as she caught sight of the man seated in the wheelchair at the end of the grand staircase, his jawline sharp, his gaze steady and terrifying, she realized that the empty altar was about to be filled with the one thing no one expected: the truth. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, overlooking a Manhattan that glittered like scattered diamonds on black velvet. For Kendra, however, the panoramic view felt like the edge of the world. She stood in the center of the master's suite, the heavy, ivory silk of the wedding gown pooling around her feet like a drift of fallen snow. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, hitched breaths she couldn't quite suppress. She was a fraudulent bride in a house of monsters. Kendra didn't dare move. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her dark eyes blurred with tears that she refused to let fall. She could feel the weight of the man behind her, the legendary Kang T-Jin. He remained in his wheelchair, a silent, immovable shadow near the balcony doors. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco drifted toward her, a masculine, grounding presence that should have terrified her, yet somehow anchored her in the midst of her panic. A soft whir of electric motors hummed against the marble. T-Jin moved his chair closer until he was positioned just at the edge of her peripheral vision. Kendra flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively, waiting for the cold interrogation, the demand to know why a servant had been sent to his bed instead of the socialite he had purchased. Instead of a shout, there was only the crisp rustle of fabric. In this house, we do not weep for those who would have watched us drown, Tijin said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration, not the raspy snarl of a villain, but the calm, disciplined tone of a man who had mastered his own pain long ago. Kendra gasped, her head snapping up in surprise. She found him watching her, his sharp, defined features softened by the dim amber light of the fireplace. He wasn't looking at her with the predatory hunger of a Mafia don or the disgust of a cheated businessman. He looked at her with a quiet, soul-deep recognition. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored black suit and withdrew a square of heavy, pristine silk. With a steady hand, one traced with the dark, intricate ink of his clan's tattoos, he held it out to her. "Clean your face, Kendra," he commanded gently. "The Bennett debt was paid the moment you stepped into the light of the foyer. You owe them nothing more, not even your grief." Her name on his lips felt like a benediction. Kendra reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the handkerchief. The silk was cool and substantial, smelling faintly of cedar. You knew," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You knew I wasn't Tiana." "I knew the moment I saw your hands at the rehearsal dinner 3 nights ago," Tijin replied, his gaze dropping to her raw, reddened knuckles, the permanent mark of her life as a servant. "Tiana Bennett has never worked a day in her life. Her hands are soft, and her heart is hollow. I didn't trade my family's protection for a porcelain doll, Kendra. I traded it for the woman who was brave enough to stay when everyone else ran." Kendra blotted her eyes, the weight of the last 3 years of humiliation suddenly feeling lighter. She looked at the man in the wheelchair, seeing the strength in his squared shoulders and the iron discipline in his steady gaze. He was a broken king to the rest of the world, a man the city pitied or feared, but in the intimacy of the penthouse, he felt like the only solid thing she had ever known. "They think they won," Kendra said, a spark of her father's old fire lighting her eyes. "Vanessa and Tiana, they think they cheated you." Tijin's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, a sharp, dangerous expression that sent a different kind of shiver down her spine. "They think they threw you to a monster to save their own skin. They don't realize that a monster knows exactly how to cherish the only beautiful thing he's ever been given." He gestured toward the master bath, where the steam was already beginning to curl around the doorframe. "Wash the scent of that house off your skin. Tomorrow the world will see a new Mrs. Kang. But tonight, you simply rest. You are safe here, Kendra. My walls are thicker than your stepmother's spite." As Kendra turned toward the warmth of the room, the silk handkerchief clutched tightly in her hand, she realized the 3 years of silence had finally ended. She had been sold as a sacrifice, but as she looked back at Tijin, who sat like a vigilant sentinel against the dark of the city, she knew she hadn't been exiled. She had been claimed. The following week had been a blur of silent luxury, a sharp contrast to the years of cold labor Kendra had endured. But tonight, the atmosphere in the penthouse felt different. The air was charged with a heavy, electric stillness that hummed beneath the floorboards. Kendra stood by the window of their shared suite, watching the moon reflect off the steel skyline, her mind racing with the quiet kindness Tijin had shown her. The designer clothes that actually fit, the meals he insisted she eat with him, and the way he spoke to her as if her opinion was the only one that mattered. She heard the soft hum of his wheelchair as he entered the room. He didn't stop by the desk as he usually did. Instead, he moved toward the heavy mahogany door. Kendra turned, her breath catching as she watched his tattooed hand reach out. With a deliberate metallic click, he turned the deadbolt. The sound felt final. "Tijin," she whispered, her heart beginning a frantic staccato beat. He didn't answer immediately. He sat there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the locked door, his broad shoulders squared. "For 2 years," he began, his voice dropping into a register so low it was almost a growl, "the world has looked at me and seen a broken man. My enemies grew bold. They stopped hiding their knives because they thought I couldn't reach them. They thought a man in a chair was a man without teeth." Kendra took a step forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand." Jin turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. The accident that paralyzed me was no accident. It was a calculated strike by men I once called brothers. I survived, but I realized that as long as I was a threat, they would keep swinging. So I gave them what they wanted. I gave them a king who couldn't stand. Then the world seemed to slow down. Jin placed his hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. His knuckles whitened, and the muscles in his forearms corded with tension. Slowly, with a fluid, lethal grace that defied everything Kendra had been told, he rose. Kendra's gasp was swallowed by the silence of the room. She watched in stunned disbelief as he stood to his full, towering height. He was massive, a pillar of strength and ink, his tailored suit hanging perfectly off a body that was anything but broken. He took a step toward her, his stride steady and predatory, until he stood directly in her space, forcing her to look up, way up to meet his gaze. You can walk, she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. I can do much more than walk, Kendra, he said, his voice now a warm, protective shadow over her. He reached out, his large hand cupping her jaw, his thumb grazing the soft skin of her cheek. I've been playing a long game. I needed a wife who wasn't part of their circle, someone who wouldn't report back to the vipers in my cabinet. I saw you at that diner months ago, exhausted but still giving your last bit of energy to help an old man cross the street. I saw you in that library, surrounded by the ghosts of your father's books, holding onto your dignity while Vanessa tried to strip it away. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his scent of cedar and power enveloping her. I chose you because I saw your heart, Kendra. I saw a survivor who didn't let the world turn her bitter. I didn't marry you to settle a debt. I married you because you were the only person in this city of monsters who deserved to sit on a throne. Kendra felt a tear escape, but this time it wasn't born of fear. It was the overwhelming weight of being seen. For years, she had been a ghost, a servant, a leftover. Now, she was standing in the arms of a man who had built a fortress of lies just to keep his true strength a secret, and he had invited her inside. They think I'm a victim, he whispered against her skin, his grip on her waist tightening with a fierce, possessive promise. They think you're a consolation prize. Let them keep thinking that until it's too late. From this moment on, we are the only two people in this world who know the truth. You are my eyes, Kendra, and I am your shield. As the realization of her new reality settled in, Kendra reached up, her fingers tracing the ink on his neck. She wasn't just a Mafia bride. She was the secret weapon of a king who had finally decided to stand up. The transformation of Kendra Bennett did not happen in a single stroke, but in a series of breathtaking, gilded humiliations for the world that had once looked past her. It began with the arrival of the trunks, vast, leather-bound chests embossed with the Kang seal that filled the dressing suite with the scent of fresh silk and Italian leather. Jin watched from his chair by the window, his expression unreadable, but his eyes tracking every flicker of emotion on Kendra's face as she touched the fabrics. He had opened the world to her, handing her a black titanium card that carried more weight than her father's entire lost estate. To Kendra, who had spent years counting pennies for a loaf of bread, the sheer gravity of the wealth felt like a new kind of oxygen, thin, heady, and dangerously sweet. I don't know how to be this person, Kendra whispered, her fingers trailing over a gown of midnight velvet. Tiana was the one who was raised for this. I was raised to be the shadow. Tiana was raised to be a decoration, Jin replied, his voice a low, grounded vibration that settled the fluttering in her chest. You were raised to survive. Decorations break under pressure, Kendra. Survivors rule. Wear the dress, not because it's pretty, but because it's armor. Under his silent direction, the leftover daughter was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. He didn't just give her things, he gave her the power that came with them. He sent her to the city's most exclusive boutiques with a phalanx of silent, suited guards, ensuring that the same shopkeepers who had once sneered at her, diner-stained, clothes now bowed until their foreheads nearly touched the glass counters. He replaced her rusted-out compact car with a sleek, obsidian black SUV that purred with a lethal, hidden strength. He filled her vanity with jewels that caught the light like trapped stars, each piece a message to the underworld that the woman beside Kang Tae-jin was untouchable. But the true spoiling wasn't in the objects. It was in the way Tae-jin looked at her when she walked into a room. He treated her with a fierce, unwavering reverence that Kendra had never known. He sat her at the head of the table during his private briefings, forcing his captains to address her as they would him. He spent hours in the quiet of the penthouse teaching her the nuances of the business, showing her that the Gilded Queen was more than just a title, it was a position of war. The news of the paralyzed boss and his mysterious, elegant bride began to leak into the social columns that Vanessa and Tiana monitored like hawks. Photos of Kendra, caught in the flash of a paparazzi bulb as she stepped out of a private jet or entered a gala, began to circulate. She looked radiant, her warm brown skin glowing against the white lace and dark silk, her posture upright and alert, her dark eyes no longer reflecting fear, but a quiet, searing intensity. In the Bennett house, the air was likely turning sour with envy. Tiana, who had eloped to live a free life, was now finding out that freedom without a throne was just another word for struggle. She had escaped a wheelchair, but she had walked away from an empire. And Kendra, the girl they had thrown away like trash, was now the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Tae-jin leaned back in his chair one evening, watching Kendra as she practiced the calligraphy of her new signature, Kendra Kang. He reached out, his tattooed fingers interlacing with hers, grounding her in the reality of their partnership. "They see the gowns and the cars," he murmured, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "They see the gold, but they don't see the woman who stayed when the world was burning. That is why I spoil you, Kendra, not because I can, but because you are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale." Kendra looked at him, the weight of the diamonds around her neck feeling lighter than the look of devotion in his eyes. She wasn't just a placeholder anymore. She was a queen, forged in the shadows and polished in the light, and for the first time in her life, she didn't just belong, she led. The flickering light of a cheap television was the only thing illuminating the cramped, salt-haired motel room where Tiana Bennett now sat. It was a far cry from the Bennett estate. The air here smelled of stale cigarettes and regret, and the freedom she had chased with Jax had quickly curdled into the bitter reality of missed meals and dwindling cash. Vanessa paced the small space like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking frantically on the stained linoleum. She had tracked Tiana down a week ago, not out of maternal love, but because they were both sinking, and the news coming out of Manhattan was like salt in an open wound. "Look at her," Tiana hissed, her voice trembling as she pointed at the screen. The nightly news was broadcasting a segment on a high-profile charity gala. The camera panned to a black obsidian SUV, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the door opened. Kendra stepped out, draped in a gown of midnight velvet that shimmered like oil on water. A necklace of trapped stars caught the light at her throat, diamonds that cost more than the Bennett estate's entire remaining equity. She looked radiant, her warm brown skin glowing, her posture no longer hunched in servitude but upright and regal. Beside her, Kang Tae-jin sat in his chair, his tattooed hand resting possessively on her waist as the paparazzi's flashes turned the night into noon. "That should have been me," Tiana whispered, her eyes wide with a jagged, green-eyed fury. "That's my dress. Those are my diamonds. She's living my life." Vanessa stopped packing, her eyes narrowing as she watched Kendra lean down to whisper something into Tae-jin's ear, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "We thought we were sending her to a slaughterhouse," Vanessa murmured, her voice a low poison. "We thought he was a broken man who would break her. Instead, we handed the leftover daughter the keys to the most powerful vault in the city." The realization hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't escaped a burden. They had discarded a winning lottery ticket. Tiana looked at her own chipped nails and the cheap motel bed, then back at the screen where Kendra was being escorted into the ballroom like a queen. The envy was a living thing, a monster that clawed at her throat. "He doesn't know the truth," Tiana said, a desperate, manic light entering her eyes. "He thinks he married a Bennett. He doesn't know she's just the help we dressed up in my old rags. If the Morty family, if his own clan, finds out he was tricked, they'll discard her. He'll have to divorce her to save his reputation." Vanessa's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile. The practiced mask of the socialite returned, her mind already spinning a web of digital and social destruction. "He's a man of pride, Tiana. A mafia boss cannot afford to be seen as a fool who was duped by a servant and her scheming stepmother. If we reveal the bride swap publicly, it won't matter how much he likes her. The rules of his world will force him to cast her out." "And then," Tiana asked, her breath hitching. "And then," Vanessa replied, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair, "the seat beside him will be empty again. And this time, we'll make sure the real bride is there to fill it. We'll tell the world Kendra kidnapped you. We'll say she forced you to run so she could steal your life." It was a lie, a beautiful, lethal lie. They began to gather their remaining resources, old photos of Kendra in her diner uniform, records of her father's charity toward her, and the phone numbers of the gossip columnists Vanessa had spent years cultivating. They didn't see Kendra as a sister or a daughter. They saw her as a thief who had stolen a throne that was theirs by birthright. As the night wore on, the two women huddled over a laptop, the blue light reflecting in their eyes like the cold glow of a predator's. They were ready to set the city on fire just to see Kendra burn. They didn't know about the locked door in the penthouse. They didn't know about the man who stood up when the world wasn't looking. They thought they were hunting a maid, but they were about to walk into the den of a king who had already decided that Kendra was the only thing worth protecting. The trap was set, but Vanessa and Tiana didn't realize they were the ones walking into the cage. It began at the city's most exclusive gala, a night where the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet hum of dangerous power. Vanessa had spent her last remaining favors to secure an invitation, and Tiana stood by her side, draped in a borrowed dress that felt like a cheap imitation of the midnight velvet Kendra had worn on the news. They watched from the mezzanine as Kendra entered the ballroom, her hand resting on the armrest of T-Jin's wheelchair. She looked every bit the Mafia queen, her eyes sharp and her presence commanding. Vanessa didn't waste a moment. She moved toward the circle of Mafia elders, gray-haired men with cold eyes who sat like statues at the back of the room. With a practiced, tragic tremble in her voice, she laid out the truth. She produced the photos of Kendra in her diner uniform, the records of her father's debt, and the narrative of a scheming servant who had kidnapped her daughter and stolen her place at the altar. "My daughter, Tiana, was the one promised to you," Vanessa pleaded, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding crowd. "This woman is an imposter. She is a fraud who manipulated your boss to satisfy her own greed. She has insulted the Kang name." The ballroom fell into a suffocating silence. The elders turned their stony gazes toward T-Jin. At the same time, Tiana saw her opening. She slipped through the crowd, approaching T-Jin's side as Kendra was momentarily sidelined by the elders' scrutiny. Tiana leaned down, letting her hair brush his shoulder, her voice a desperate, sultry whisper. "She's a lie, T-Jin," Tiana murmured, her fingers trailing near his tattooed neck. "I'm the one you were promised. I'm the one who belongs in your bed. Let me fix this. Let me be the bride you deserve." T-Jin didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. Instead, his hand, the one covered in the ink of his clan, clamped around Tiana's wrist with the force of a steel trap. The silence in the room grew heavy, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. "You think I don't know who I married?" T-Jin's voice wasn't a whisper. It was a low, grounded roar that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He didn't just speak, he acted. To the collective gasp of every soul in the ballroom, the broken king placed his hands on the armrests of his chair. With a fluid, terrifying grace, he rose. He stood to his full, towering height, dwarfing the terrified Tiana and the ashen-faced Vanessa. The secret was out, but it wasn't a revelation of weakness. It was a declaration of war. He looked down at Tiana, his eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. You ran because you were too weak to face a man you thought was broken. You eloped with a boy who couldn't even pay your bus fare. And now you come here, into my house, and insult my wife. Tijin turned his gaze to Vanessa and the elders, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Kendra didn't steal a place. I chose her. I watched her survive your cruelty for years, and I decided she was the only woman in this city worthy of the Kang name. You didn't trick me, Vanessa. You gave me the only diamond in your house of glass because you were too blind to see its value. He reached out, his arms sliding around Kendra's waist, pulling her flush against his side. This is my wife. She is the queen of the Kang family, and anyone who dares to call her a fraud or tries to touch what belongs to me will find out exactly why they call me a monster. Vanessa's evidence was swiped off the table by a silent guard, and within seconds, she and Tiana were being dragged toward the exit, their screams for mercy muffled by the music that Tijin signaled to resume. They had come to ruin Kendra's reputation, but they had only succeeded in proving her power. They were cast out into the night, penniless and permanently exiled from the world they had tried so hard to reclaim. Kendra looked up at the man standing beside her, the man who had risked his greatest secret just to shield her honor. The fear was gone. In its place was a fierce, unwavering pride. She wasn't the leftover daughter anymore. She was the woman who had helped a king stand up, and as they stood together in the center of the room, she knew the world was finally theirs. The morning after the gala, the Bennett estate felt smaller than Kendra remembered. As she stepped out of the obsidian SUV, the gravel crunching under her designer heels, she didn't feel the phantom weight of the silver trays or the damp chill of the basement. She wore a suit of ivory silk, her posture graceful and unyielding, while the silent, towering presence of Tijin walked beside her. The world still whispered about the miracle of his recovery, but as he reached out to catch Kendra's hand, his grip steady and warm, she knew the only miracle was the one they had built together. Inside the foyer, Vanessa and Tiana were waiting, surrounded by packed suitcases and the wreckage of their failed coup. They looked haggard, their eyes darting between Tijin's formidable height and the legal documents Kendra held in her hand. "Kendra, please," Vanessa began, her voice cracking, stripped of its usual honeyed venom. "We're family. You can't just throw us out. Think of what your father would say." "My father would ask where his legacy went," Kendra replied, her voice calm and absolute. "He would ask why his daughter was treated like a ghost in her own home while you bled his life's work dry." She placed the documents on the marble table, the same table she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled. "I have settled every cent of the debt my father left behind. The Bennett name is clear, but the estate belongs to the Kang family now." Kendra leaned in, her dark eyes flashing with the fire of 3 years of suppressed justice. "You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry. If you ever set foot on this property, or approach me or my husband again, the police will be the least of your concerns. Tijin's associates are not as patient as I am." Tiana let out a jagged sob, reaching for Kendra's sleeve, but Tijin stepped forward. He didn't say a word, but the cold intensity in his gaze, the gaze of a man who had hunted traitors while the world thought him helpless, sent her reeling back. "Go," Kendra commanded. She watched from the grand doorway as the 2 women who had defined her misery were ushered into a waiting taxi, carrying nothing but the remnants of their greed. There was no joy in the moment, only a profound, echoing peace. The leftover daughter had finished her work. When the gates finally swung shut, Tijin turned to her. He didn't look like a boss or a monster. He looked like a man who had finally found his North Star. He pulled her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. "The debt is paid, Kendra," he murmured, his tattooed fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "The house is quiet. What happens now?" Kendra looked out at the city skyline, where the penthouse waited, their true home, high above the wolves and the whispers. She thought of the journey from the catering station to the throne, from the wheelchair to the standing king. Now, Kendra said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips as she leaned into his strength. We show this city how a king and queen really rule. As they drove away from the ghosts of the past, the sun caught their wedding rings, casting a golden light over the path ahead. They were no longer broken, no longer hiding, and no longer alone. They were the new rule, and Manhattan belonged to them.